Hello, I'm Kristen Eulenbrock. I am the director of the Institute for Science and Policy. As part of our 2023 Symposium, we hosted an in-person evening panel and discussion. The Ethics of Science-Based Decisions, Reflections from Colorado Leaders. We did have a small minor hiccup in the evening's recording, which is why I'm here now giving you this intro video. But I did want to give you a little introduction into who you're going to hear from. First up, we had welcoming remarks from Congressman Joe Neguse.
Good evening, and welcome to the Institute for Science and Policy's annual symposium. Thank you to the folks at the Denver Museum for Science and Nature for extending me an invitation, and my sincerest apologies for not being able to join you all in person. Tonight, you all will take part in an important panel discussion of the importance of ethical decision-making, touching on when and why we turn to data, empirical evidence, and science to inform our ability to make hard choices. Before you begin, I will simply say this. We can't make good decisions, informed decisions, if we're not working from the best available information. And to understand the full scale of a problem, to know how best to prepare and evaluate how to respond, we need an wide array of voices, opinions, and perspectives. It's also absolutely critical that policymakers like myself work together with researchers and scientists and institutions that are navigating all sorts of nuanced issues so that we're able to take, again, well-informed, important steps towards addressing some of the most consequential threats and challenges of our time. I commend all of the thought leaders and the scientists that are taking part in this evening's important event, and I encourage you all to continue to engage with one another in the years to come. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. Please enjoy the panel, and as always, stay safe, stay healthy, and stay hopeful.
And now I'd like to introduce you to our panel this evening. You're going to be hearing from Roger Pielke Jr. He is a science writer and professor from the University of Colorado Boulder, where he's been there for more than 20 years, teaching and writing on a really diverse range of policy and governance issues related to science, technology, environment, energy, climate, innovation, and sports. He has a pretty well-known book. It's called The Honest Broker, Making Sense of Science in Policy and Politics. And now he has a really popular Substack by this name as well. Also on our panel is Beth Rudin. Beth is CEO and chairman of Bast AI, a global executive leader with 20 plus years of IT and data science experience, including working with IBM. She made innovation with analytics and AI into a $2 billion business and intends to show the world what it feels like to experience trusted AI. In 2023, she was recognized as one of the 100 most brilliant leaders in AI ethics. She also just released her book called AI for the Rest of Us. And our third panelist is Dominic Moreno, Deputy Chief of Staff for Strategy for Denver's Mayor Mike Johnson. At the age of 24, Dominic was elected as the youngest person to City Council for Commerce City. And many of you may know Dominic as Senator Moreno, because for just a few months ago, Dominic had to step down to take on this new role, but he had previously served two terms in Colorado's House of Representatives before being elected to the Colorado Senate in 2016, where he served on the very important Joint Budget Committee, as well as then serving as a Senate Majority Leader. We started off our conversation that evening talking about evidence-based decisions. In the most simplest terms, it's about evaluating and applying empirical information to a decision, then using critical thinking about how to solve that problem. This understands and requires transparency, often looking at multiple lines of evidence and data. It's about being relevant and reliable, and making sure decisions reflect uncertainty. And then, of course, there's some sort of accountability. So that's kind of where we started our conversation. The first question I asked our panel was, what responsibility does a decision maker have to utilize evidence in a policy process?
With any background, and there is no requirement that they consider science or evidence when they make decisions. The president can go and tell you to drink bleach. And we see over time, we did a study of science advisors under all presidents, and it turns out that whether you're a Democrat or Republican, you tend to favor that science and evidence that is more politically advantageous to you. So reconciling the need for expertise with the realities, the human realities of decision making and how we all are, where I land on this is that we can't count on individuals to always make the best decisions or always be the most ethical. We need strong institutions. And fortunately, institutions like the Institute here, but also across government, we have many institutions where we solicit expert advice, we institutionalize data collection, and in general, that works really well because we don't have to depend on the ethics or character of any one individual. But when it breaks down, we notice it. And I'll just give an example from some research we did. In the United States is one of the few countries around the world that had no high-level COVID advisory committee. So under the Trump administration, there was the so-called coronavirus task force that was comprised of political appointees. It was not experts out there. Most countries you went to, and they worked, more or less well, had experts to provide advice at least. So in the United States, if you wanted to know, well, what are the consequences of taking kids out of schools or whatever the decision happened to be, we were operating without that. And it turns out that, the state of Colorado had their expert advisory committee, state of Nebraska had theirs, state of Alaska had theirs, and people could go expert shopping. And they could say, well, here's the decision I want to make. I'm going to go find somebody who can legitimize that. And so, the opening remark I have here is we need really strong institutions, and that depends as much on us experts as it does on elected officials, maybe more.
Well, good evening. Thanks for having me. I think it's appropriate that we're talking a lot about reflection because I've been doing a lot of that recently, given that I recently transitioned from an elected role to now still serving in government, but at a different level and not as the principal decision maker, which has been a really interesting experience to get used to. One thing that Roger really that you said that really resonated with me is one of the strengths of our system is that we are a democratic system where anyone in this room could run for office and become an elected official. But what that also results in is that most elected officials who serve in office do not come from a strong science, factual background, right? I mean, that I can count on probably one hand the number of scientists or engineers that I served with over the years. And it's really actually appropriate that the two engineers that I served with on the Joint Budget Committee were the ones that sponsored a law that required us to consider evidence-based decision-making in the budgeting process so that we would actually evaluate requests for funding with evidence. What a novel idea. Like, that had actually never happened before. It was just the governor's proposing that we spend dollars here, and the Joint Budget Committee would just make a determination, do we want to do that or do we not? But now there's actually a framework for how are we going to evaluate this budget request to see if, one, it solves the problem, and two, if it solves it effectively. So it's been a really interesting experience, and believe it or not, truly, Colorado is known as a leader, but this work only happened in 2019. That is when the law passed, and so now there's been a couple of budget cycles where we're now using evidence to evaluate different budget requests. But even throughout that process, which I always thought was very fascinating, I had a colleague on the budget committee who was on the opposite end of the political spectrum from myself, and I will go to my grave remembering this quote because it stood out to me that much. His response in relation to this evidence-based decision-making process in budgeting was, don't show me evidence, I don't believe it. And it was kind of like, what? Like, really? Like, and it really, we're in this time now where people are questioning evidence. They're questioning viewpoints. They're questioning facts. And that's, it's an interesting time, but also a very scary time to live in my opinion.
So one of the stories that I tell is in 2013, a peer of mine, a social scientist, got on the TED stage. And she said, I work for Facebook, and I can tell if you've done drugs with 5 of your likes, to an 80% statistical certainty. And I think in my head, I was like, thank goodness, the cat is out of the bag. Everybody understands. And when I, talk about AI ethics, I am a trained anthropologist, so I define my terms first. And ethics comes from the word ethos. It's the atmosphere in which we live. And it is the atmosphere that we as social animals, social human beings, understand how to behave in that atmosphere using the unstructured rules, the unwritten rules, the unspoken rules. And when in IBM, we got to establish a data science profession. And part of when I started that data science profession, I was a social scientist, there was a mathematician and a statistician. They did not want to let me in the club, but I did all the documentation, so I got to be in the club. Not true. Incredible people. But what we were doing all the way back in 2012, when the Harvard Business Review said that data science would become the sexiest job in the 21st century, we were really trying to understand how we could create a process in order to make decisions, because we knew that the models that we're creating were making decisions on behalf of millions of people. And there are so many choices that data engineers make. There are so many choices that data scientists make. And I look at the definition of the word trust, which is making something you value vulnerable to somebody else's actions. That is trust. And if I think about my daughter who opens up her WhatsApp, and I think about how much or how many people's choices were made in order to display the very new AI on WhatsApp that she's now interacting with, I think about how do I trust that all of those people were making good choices in order to build this model that serves up the next set of features or words or statements that this AI creates. And I don't have a great answer for you, but I'm going to tell you what my daughter said. And she is 13, and when she got the very first AI WhatsApp on her AI, she goes, Mom, I'm going to name it Curtis. And I don't really like Curtis because he responds too quickly. I can tell he's lying.
Okay, I want to actually just kind of pick up on this thread here, because you started it, right, of trust. But I'm going to take it back to the idea of responsibility, which also can be potentially interpreted as accountability. You all wear very different hats, and you have very different responsibilities and accountabilities, potentially, right? You could think about this, you said how many millions of people, right, billions of people in essence, right, will use technology, right? That's a pretty big accountability, responsibility. A scientist or a researcher has all types of accountability and responsibility, both to society, but also to universities, the academic research community itself, elected, we know you're not elected anymore, or even people who are elected that you work for, responsibility to the citizens in which they serve, their constituents, right? So responsibility and accountability. Take this one step further, right? How would you define that? Because it's one thing for me to briefly high-level articulate it. It's another thing to think about the traits of what does it mean to impact how you make a decision, right? What is that lens and that frame that you think about through either your own experience or that of how you think about responsibility and then ultimately accountability? Everyone's nodding, so I want to see who wants to jump on this first. Go for it.
Well, I'll go ahead and start. As an elected official, my metric, my responsibility, my accountability in the decisions I made was always, is this going to benefit or harm the community that I represent? And what's interesting and what's sometimes conflicting when you serve in elected office is a decision that would benefit my community, others would view that it harms theirs, right? If they have a different point of view, if they represent a different constituency. And so those were always kind of the battles that you see in public policy and that you see down at the state capitol is that conflict, that inherent conflict of I represent one community, you represent a different community, and we're all just trying to do right by the people that put us in those positions. My own personal way of interacting with that reality at the Capitol was always to try to listen as much as possible, to really listen to the people who share a different perspective than I have, to really try to get a sense for where are they coming from, what life experiences led them to hold the political views that they now have and that they defend. That is becoming less and less and less common in our current system. People aren't listening. They're not taking the time to actually interact with someone that's different from them. Instead, it's just you either believe what I believe, you either are with me on this or you're against me. And I think that really does a disservice to the democratic process, to the system of truly and genuinely interacting with ideas that are different than your own. Because at the end of the day, for me, even though it didn't often change my perspective on things, it at least made me stronger. It made my arguments stronger. It made me believe even more in what I was advocating for. And so for me, that accountability to your constituency, super important. That is who put you there. But you also have a responsibility to interact with people who think differently than you, who have a different value set, because ultimately, better public policy is made when you actually do that.
Let me follow up with you, Dominic, and then we'll come to you all, because what you just said, right, it's very different to be elected official because of the accountability that you have of your constituents, which is if they don't feel you're representing their interest, you no longer have a job, potentially, if they are an engaged constituency, right? That's quite different than other jobs. And you just articulated a beautiful framing, which is to both be responsible to your constituency and to listen to different interests. And I'm guessing you're alluding to different political party. Is that correct? I'm trying to think of how do I want to go with this question, because we could spend a whole other panel on this question. I mean, we're not seeing that as likely. We're not seeing that, right, what you just framed, for a variety of reasons. What would you say to that? Give me like some sort of like reflection that you've had now that you aren't responsive to constituents that like you would maybe give to others who are holding elective office right now.
Yeah, for me, what's interesting is the ultimate accountability for an elected official is whether you are representing your constituency, whether you're representing the community that elected you. I think the challenge that we always had at the Capitol, and we actually had a couple of instances of this in which is it exclusively the job of voters to hold elected officials accountable? Or is it your colleagues as well? Should your colleagues be the arbiters of conduct, of ethical ethical behavior. And we really struggled with this. Actually, I was in the General Assembly where, for the first time in 100 years, we actually expelled a member of the General Assembly. I don't know if some of you remember this. It was during the Me Too movement, and there was very serious allegations of sexual harassment. And that was an instance in which the body, the legislative body itself, decided we need to hold this person accountable. Like, it's not enough to allow them to go through the next election. Maybe their voters make the right decision, maybe they don't. We, as a body, have to hold each other to a certain standard as well. And so I would say more of that too, right? More accountability for elected officials is a good thing, whether it comes from the constituency that elected them, whether it comes from their colleagues, it needs to happen. To the question of why aren't people engaging? Why aren't they doing that? I have a lot of theories. I don't know if they're evidence-based or not. I don't know. I can't make that conclusion quite yet. But from my experience, from my what I've seen, is that the ways we interact with each other today differ. We no longer, right, the face-to-face communication, the in-person communication, it's just less. It's a lot more online interaction. It's a lot more of what I would view as a slightly less personal communication method. And when that happens, I think this is unfair, but I think it does give some people permission to treat others as less than a person, to treat them as some kind of caricature or some kind of archetype that they have in mind of who that person is. You only truly start to break that down when you directly interact with one another. I was really surprised. I would consider some of my closest friends in the General Assembly were on the other side of the aisle who I had nothing in common with. We shared zero common experiences, no common background. They were from a rural area. I was from an urban area. The difference in age, they were 50 years older than I am. But we found common ground because we actually had similar values. Yes, we reached different conclusions. We reached different political positions, but we had a similar set of values, and that's what we always leaned into.
Yeah, I'll go next. And I'll give it a very similar answer from a different perspective. But I want to ask a question of the audience. How many of you heard that 3 Ivy League professors testified before Congress yesterday? Yeah, just about everybody. So we're in an era where experts, and I mean credentialed experts, PhDs, university presidents, scientists, are really visible in politics. All of us, I'm sure this room is full of experts, but every single one of us is inexpert in most everything. And the way that we encounter evidence and come to believe it is through trust. And so in your first anecdote about your colleague across the aisle who said, I don't believe the evidence, there's actually good data to suggest that we are in kind of a period of a crisis of trust in experts across society. It gets boiled down to, well, it's a Republican versus Democrat thing, but it's not. If you look at the data, it turns out that there's one group who has very strong and growing trust in experts: white, rich, highly educated people in this country. People who don't: Democrats with a terminal high school degree, Republicans, Hispanics, African Americans. It turns out that us experts, as we have engaged the political process, we have chosen to appeal, and the reality is that the expert community is rich, white, male, leans to the left. We promote policies and politics to the public that reflect that group's interests. And so it's very easy for someone across the aisle to say, well, when I look at those experts, I don't see myself, so I'm not going to trust them. It's not rejection of science. In everything that we're an inexpert on, we don't have the ability to evaluate. So we trust And this gets to the point of, talking to people, reaching across the aisle. And so the responsibility, I would say, that we experts have is a responsibility to democracy. Expertise is too important for us experts to say, we're political advocates, and we're going to advocate for what our little group wants, university professors. I'm on a university campus. It's not particularly representative, really of anything. And wonderful people, they're great, but it's not elected officials. And so we experts have to be also held accountable. We have to do a better job of when we testify before Congress, like you saw yesterday, whatever you think of the merits are, there are ways to appeal to people across a broad spectrum, and there are ways not to. And we experts should know better. We're really visible. It's important. And last thing I'll say is democracy is far too important for experts to be just another set of political campaigners out there. Because we have something special. We know how to run nuclear power plants. We can fly airplanes. We can create vaccines. But in order for all of that to work, everybody in society, 330 million, has to trust us. And that means being part of society, not a little special interest group.
I have so many things. I think, to answer your question directly, I completely agree with Roger and Dominic in that the experts or those that have power or knowledge have responsibility and accountability. Not to totally quote Stan Lee, but that is truly, the basis of integrity. And, living a whole, which integrity comes from integer, which is a whole number. It means to be whole. And the constructs that we have in today's world and the social systems that Dominic brought up, are really being meddled with by a very small amount of homogeneous people who own control of the algorithms. And the algorithms are not fracturing our realities creating more divisive kind of systems. And in the realm of, AI, that's just going to amplify, but really what the algorithms are doing is that they are outraging us to engage us. So they're preying upon our Paleolithic bodies, and our medieval systems that can't keep up with how the technology is changing. And this godlike technology is in the hands of very few people who, again, are making loads of decisions without having social science training on what ethics is and how to understand the stories like apartheid and designed racism, and the stories about how when apartheid was being broken apart, there were literally almost 100 different scenarios where loads of people died, and they chose the one single scenario where people didn't die. And to make policy decisions based on evidence, you have to have the accountability to truly understand that evidence in the context of the decision that you're making and understand the layers of effect. And we are learning so much more now. In the work that I do is in explainable AI, and explaining to somebody that they can't, that they are part of a group that is if something is only 80% right, what does 20% look like? And so if they are the 20%, you're like, sorry, Grandma, of course you need this surgery, but that's what 20% looks like. And people don't understand probabilities, much less how to explain how that probability made a decision. And so in the realm of using algorithms in order to outrage humans, to engage to platforms, to increase the profitability of a very small amount of homogeneous people is not a good use of power. And one of the things that I ask people a lot is, what do you think power is for? What is the purpose of power? Ultimately, it's safety. If you ask people in all walks of life at one point or another, it's safety. And so as a human race, as a people, as an ecosystem, I think that, when we are choosing leaders who are responsible for their constituents, there is an internal accountability that needs to be had to the wider ecosystem in which their constituents are living in.
Okay, I want to pick up on this wider ecosystem as you allude to, because one of the framings right around ethical decision making and ethics is the idea that we're doing something for the common good, right, or for the public interest, right? I mean, we say we're doing it for greater humanity, and it's a beautiful ethical North Star, and that is extremely hard, because our society is very diverse and full of different peoples and interests, right? So that means, so you can have that kind of North Star ethical goal for the common good, for the public interest, right? And then when you start to bring that into practice, that gets really complicated really quickly, right? That's full of trade-offs. I would love you all to bring some real-world examples in here, whether it's something you've personally been involved in or something that you've witnessed, where we have to make trade-offs as a society. We can think about climate and the energy transition. We can think about the use of technology and how quickly that's advancing, right? The list can go on. That there is not one single answer. There is not one clear pathway forward to serve the public interest or to serve the common good, particularly in a global society. So, who wants to start with me of bringing in an example where you've had to think about or you've witnessed this weighing of trade-offs, and perhaps what was a factor? Just, it doesn't have to be all the factors. There's a factor or two that came into your decision making. Roger, do you want to start with that?
Sure. I'll tell a story. Yeah. A million years ago, literally, I worked on the Hill for the House Science Committee. I was a young, glorified intern. My mentor was a guy named Rad Byerly. Passed away a few years ago, but he was the chief of staff. He brought me to Washington, and when I worked for him as a master's student, University of Colorado Boulder, on space policy, we pumped out paper after paper, analysis after analysis that said, at the time, space station freedom was a waste of money. It was a turkey, no good. So I go to Washington, and one of the first tasks I put on, the chairman of the committee, a guy named George Brown from California, he was on the authorization committee, and the appropriations committee had just killed the space station program. It was dead. We were like, oh, that's great. That's exactly what we recommended. We're experts. The chairman came to the staff and he said, we're going to save the space station program. And so my mentor, Rad Byerly, the chief of staff, said, all right, here's what we're going to do. He said, Roger, I want you to write a speech for how important it is to have the space station program. And I said, Rad, explain this to me. We just spent 3 years documenting how this is a waste of money. And now you're having me write something I don't believe. He said, that's right. I said, well, how can that be? He said, well, Mr. Brown was elected and you weren't. And if you don't like it, you can leave. So I wrote a speech, and a representative from Idaho read it on the floor of the House, and I felt really proud and really conflicted all at the same time. But for me, I realized that the common interest is not something that an expert brings to the population. The common interest is the function of a process. And you go through the democratic process, and it's a sausage factory for sure. But what comes out, if the process works as it should work, is then the common interest. And we experts can have input like everybody else, but it's very difficult to specify that in advance. So it's very much a proceduralist, small d democratic notion of what the common interest is. And I think one of the things we experts have to do is make peace with that process. Because a lot of times, experts are going to disagree with what the populace decides to do, but this is the beauty of democracy, is that it produces something that, in the end, is the common interest. And it may be imperfect, there's systematic racism, there's all sorts of issues in the democratic process, but in trying to perfect that, we're always getting a little bit, ideally, a little bit closer to what that common interest is.
Roger, you and I could talk all night about the dysfunctions of government. How late do they keep the bar open, actually? Because
9.
we could talk about this. You know, it's so interesting. Common interest, common good. I've served on a school board, and that is where I learned that you can cover up all manner of sins by saying it's for the kids. You know, all of government, all of public policy is trade-offs. I mean, there isn't enough capacity. You're never going to be able to do all the things you want. There's interest groups that influence the process. It is literally all trade-offs. And what you hope is that there are elected officials that are grounded enough to know, I am doing this for the right reason. I am doing this for my community. Doesn't always happen, but that is, in its purest form, that is the hope that happens. I think the pandemic was a great example from a lot of different perspectives on this issue of science and decision making. For me, it was a very personal experience because I served on the Joint Budget Committee during COVID, when the expectation was that revenues would plummet and that the state would have to cut something like $3 billion from the state budget. And my colleagues and I kind of sat down, we kind of discussed how are we going to do this? This is a monumental task. You have to cut 10% of the state budget. Where are we even going to start? What are we going to do? And it's interesting. We all kind of came around to the way of moving forward, which was we were going to try to do the least amount of harm. In all of these budget cuts, we would never consider, for example, cutting intellectual and developmental disability services. We would never cut K through 12 education. We would never cut. We had we developed these values of these are vulnerable populations, and we simply cannot have them be the sacrifice that gets us to a balanced budget. The common good there was, and actually the responsibility that we had was that we had to balance the state budget. We are constitutionally required to balance the state budget. The trade-offs were, all the different programs that we really had to look at and say, okay, this isn't needed right now. We either have to stop funding to them, or we actually have to actually have a rescission, bring back the funding that we had allocated for that initiative. It was a really hard time because your job as an elected official is you want to help people. You want to try to solve problems. And that was very much an instance in which that was not the job. That was not the task. You're not trying to help people in that situation. You're trying to do the least amount of harm. And I remember very clearly, actually, after this series of cuts that we had to make in the state budget, I got a call from a reporter at Colorado Public Radio, and he wanted to verify a couple of numbers and make sure that his reporting was accurate. And then he said, and how are you? That couldn't have been easy to cut all those different programs, to balance the state budget in the wake of a historic crisis. And I started bawling. I cried because no one ever asks you how you are when you take on monumental tasks like that. 2, though, I was like, this is not what I thought I would be doing. This is not what I wanted to do as an elected official. But it was one of those tasks. It was one of those trade-offs that you had to make in order to meet your obligation, your duty to the state.
I'm going to take this in a little bit of a different direction. I think, we've all talked about, having the accountability if you have the power or the platform or the pulpit or you are an expert. When I was talking to somebody this morning and we were talking about doctor, and the doctor was like, hey, I used ChatGPT to get the human readable level interpretation of a radiology report. And, you know, the aspect of being a doctor or being in a position and then using a tool like AI for decision support seems perfectly reasonable. And, you know, both of us were like, oh my gosh, did patient records just go into ChatGPT and all of the things that we are concerned with as far as privacy. But more importantly, we got to an actual question that is something that was even better. How come that radiology report isn't already human readable? Why aren't we democratizing knowledge in a way, or using artificial intelligence to democratize knowledge instead of having a radiology report be read by a radiologist that has to go to school that is part of a dominant paradigm of elitism in order to be able to have access to go to that school to learn to read the radiology report. And I'm inverting this because I really want people to start to think about the fact that our systems are supporting all of our social values, our ethics. There's 188 cognitive biases that every single human being carries around with them. And when we are, you know, talking about the ethics of decision making, the conclusion that I've always come to is like, how do we be explicit about our own biases? How do we be explicit about our subjectivity and make sure we lay that on the table to say, you know, here's what I'm coming to the table with. This is what I understand. This is the reason that I understand it. This is how I know what I know. And I think that that type of dialogue is why you, Dominic, you know, you found that connection to people based on values, not based on political parties or associations or teams or tribes or what have you. And, you know, I think that as people in power, understanding how to diplomatically ask the right question, like, why isn't the radiology report in a readable, usable way? Why aren't we making things that it is transparent for everyone to understand what it means? Why are we creating systems that support ineffectual understanding that has to be, you know, curated through jargon?
I want to come back to you, Beth, on this, because it's, you know, we're talking about, are you asking the right question? Are you understanding what the root of the problem is, right? And sometimes we forget to do that. And, you know, something that was said today, which I'm sure this audience heard or already knows, but science is done by humans, right? There's not something over here, right? Science is done by humans, so it's filled with values, it's filled with biases, it's filled with all these things. We have to recognize and own that and be really cognizant that is how we do science. And I thought that was a really strong message that resonated today. But let me kind of start here. I'm going to kind of combine a couple audience questions here. You know, I'm going to start with the framing, which was Roger mentioned the importance of expanding the conversation to include groups who don't generally trust experts, right? And then what are these practical ways that we could do that? And how do we kind of communicate this, right? Because you were just talking about language and communication, and the whole thing was about communication. So make this practical for this audience, right? Ethics can sometimes be very heady and up here, but what are some practical ways, whether on how you include groups or how you build trust or how you communicate? And Beth, I want to actually start with you because you were talking, and we'll kind of run on down.
So one of with the release of ChatGPT, and the best description that I've ever heard of it is it's a linguistic transport layer. So we can transport language, we can make something simpler, we can combine it with other language and have it write papers for us. And you know, the way that we could use this technology is, you know, to give people language, is to give people an understanding, give people a Rosetta Stone, give people to, you know, an understanding that says, in this discipline, you know this, but it really means X. My favorite example is, you know, a mom who has 4 children under 10, and she's going out to get her very first job. And, you know, she comes to my technology and my conversational AI, and the conversational AI says, hey, did you know that you have logistics and supply chain skills? And the mom goes, what? What's that? And the conversational AI says, well, do you know how much peanut butter is in your pantry? You understand supply, and that you understand you have to go to the store to buy more peanut butter, and that comes from somewhere else. That's supply chain. And I think that we need to be using this technology to give people language. Brene Brown, huge fan, says that most people have 5 words for their emotions. For the feelings that they feel in their body, 5 words. Sad, mad, happy, glad, something very similar. We need to give people more language. We need to give people, you know, the gift of what nostalgia is. There's so many things that we could do with language, and I'm so excited about what we could really find out about communication.
I want to know why ChatGPT, whenever I ask it to draw a cartoon for my Substack, only draws white men. All right.
I have an answer for you.
I'm going to make the case that this notion of science communication, which I've seen rise over the last 20 years in my field, sometimes doesn't serve us particularly well. We tell young scientists, postdocs, go out online, communicate your science. And a lot of times that gets translated into people saying, here's what you should do. Here's what I believe. And another role that we could play as experts, instead of telling people what to do, we could tell them what they could do. And so we could give them an understanding of their options. So it's COVID, and there's a question about whether we keep kids out of schools or not. Well, there's a number of different ways we could make those decisions. We could keep them out of schools entirely, have them in schools entirely, have them go to schools, limited number of days, whatever. Laying out those options and what we think the consequences are, giving them to elected officials, to the public, is a very different role for experts. When I talk about this with experts, a lot of times they say to me, well, that's not a good idea, because they might pick the wrong one. When I talk to elected officials, not all of them, but some of them say, well, that's not a good idea, because then they're going to see that I'm the one making the decision, not the expert. So there's a lot of ways to rethink how we engage in communication as experts. And there are ways to empower democratic decision making, which means letting go of authority, power, the ability to dictate outcomes, and letting the democratic process work. But it also requires good leadership. Leaders have to be able to be willing to go out and say, tell me what the options are. Instead of saying, here's what I want to do, give me some data that I can use to support what I already decided.
I think one of the hardest realizations I had as an elected official was that I was not an expert in anything, which maybe is why people don't trust elected officials. I don't know. The reality is you are stretched so thin in terms of the issues that you are presented with, the decisions that you have to make, that you have to rely on outside experts in order to make those determinations. In terms of building that trust, though, I have found you have to establish commonality. Doesn't matter how different the other person is from you, you have to find that little shred, that little thing that means that you share something in common. For me, in talking to one of the most conservative colleagues on the Joint Budget Committee, I remember one time I just mentioned to her, I pay off my credit card debt every month. I hate debt. I hate being in debt. I think it's bad. So I pay off my credit card every month. And she was like, Dominic, I love you. Totally agree. I hate debt too. And then she went off on that's why government debt's so bad. I was like, all right, you're losing me, but but that was the commonality. That was the one piece where she was like, oh my gosh, we're actually not so different. We run our personal finances the same. Very different views on the finances of government, but at least there was that little bit. And then there was that trust. that going forward, even though we were going to reach different conclusions, she trusted that when I presented a position or I said something, that I wasn't just making stuff up, that she actually trusted what I had to say.
Right, that was kind of a takeaway from our morning conversation. Right? This is actually really relational, right? It isn't necessarily about all these things of communication and everything to do. It so much just comes down to relational, because then you can actually start to work on hard things where you can disagree. Have many of you been following that kind of Governor Cox, Governor Polis, let's learn to disagree better sort of conversation, right? I think there's a lot of opportunity for all of us when we have a microphone to try to model some of that. This panel has actually been pretty good. We haven't had any disagreement and debate, and but it's encouraging for us to do that when I think you can find some relational things, so it doesn't feel like people are attacking one another, right? You're looking at ideas and you're interrogating ideas. So I'm going to kind of put that all back to you all to really think about where are those relationships you have with people that don't see like you, right? Who think differently than you, and then how can you have that productive conversation? Okay, we're going to wrap up here because Nicole gave me that wave that we're getting close. So I want you all as a panel, I was going to give you your, like, if you had a wish list sort of thing, like what's that one thing you would change from like a decision-making, policy-making thing, right? I'm sure that wish list is long. So pick something from it. And maybe can you pick something that, because this is probably a pretty solutions-oriented group, or a group that wants to go interrogate and think about things critically, right? So put out the idea that you think that you wish could be different or could change. And again, I do this. Like the first person to really make strong eye contact with me, you're going to go first. Not it. Okay, so Beth, start us, and you all can chime in.
I really want to see the world, and I think in terms of pendulums, and right now we're very brittle because we are valuing an individual. And this idea of a single head, an individual. And I really want to see that pendulum flip to well-performing teams. And I think that that's so necessary in our entire world, where we have models where it's not one person that has all of the power. Don't give that one single person that power. And there's a beautiful Netflix show called The Diplomat, and fantastic show, but she is a U.S. ambassador in London, she has a staff of 800 people. And I think about how large our government is, and the figurehead or the person who is in charge does not represent the will of all of those 800 people. And so, how do we think in terms of what does a well-performing team or a social organism or an ecosystem of people working together look like, as opposed to an executive branch, a judicial branch, a legislative branch, having balance and control, but still brittle because we have a human being in charge who is not truly held accountable. I could go into corporate personhood at this point, but I won't. But I think that that's my wish, is I want the pendulum to go from individual and individualism to well-performing team, social community structures. How do we look at that?
Yeah, I'm going to have actually a very similar example. When I started working on issues of science and policy 30 years ago, it was a niche area. People said science and policy, who cares? It turns out it's really important, as we learned through the pandemic and everything else. And the example I've used a lot lately is that we need to treat the art of connecting science and policy more like diplomacy. Diplomacy is an art, and there are schools of diplomacy. There are government, the State Department is full of diplomats. You can get trained in diplomacy. It's not a science, it's an art, and we need more institutions like the Institute, and there are more. They're growing. I'm familiar with the groups in Oregon and Missouri and elsewhere at the state level trying to better connect science and policy, but we need more institutions to help our practices catch up with the need. So my wish would be for more conversations like the one we're having tonight, which is amazing. People coming out at night to talk about science and policy is like, it's like a dream come true. But we need more institutions that sit at that interface because it's really important, and it will only become more important going forward.
I would say my wish would be to limit the influence of money in public policy decision making. I think the equation of money as free speech is the worst determination I think I've ever seen made in the history of our country. And, I've seen it. I've seen it up close, unfortunately, how much decisions are made and they are influenced by money. Just a very specific example, I remember I had a colleague who, was dead set on his opinion on a certain issue, on a certain bill, and I had a lobbyist ask me, well, who does he listen to? I was like, well, why do you want to know that? And they're like, so I know who to hire in order to talk to him about it. That's not how the system was ever contemplated, I think, that was ever designed. Yes, there should be the right to petition your government and your elected officials, but the way it works today, I don't think is how it was ever intended. And I'm not sure we're ever going to get back to that confidence in government and in elected officials unless we change that.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Have me join me in thanking this panel this evening. Thank you. Very good. As you could tell, we could be up here for hours. Thank you all for being here tonight. I'm going to pick up on this theme. It does take a team to make these things possible. We have an amazing team of colleagues here at the museum, not only my institute team, but so many others who are working with us. We have Ben and Warren and our tech team. We have Gray, and I saw Nadine and Kat and many others on our catering team and staff, Jesus and Larry. I know people are backstage. So join me in thanking all those behind the scenes who've made tonight possible. Thank you. Okay. Enjoy yourselves. Hopefully you get to talk and meet someone new. Try to take the intention to walk up to someone you don't know and say hi. And thank you all. That's the end of tonight's program. The rest is just drinking and having fun. So thanks for being here.